Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody today to our discussion on Tulsa. I'm Joshua Cotton from the Institute of Social Justice and Race Relations here at Jackson State, as well as the Department of History and Philosophy. And we are presenting to you this discussion today on Tulsa in coordination with the Department of History and Philosophy. And we actually have our special guest today, Mr. Eli Grayson, who will be giving this great discussion today. Bit of trivia for you. That jazz musician you just heard was a Mr. Hal Cornbread Singer, who was actually a survivor of the Tulsa massacres. Mr. Singer was actually born, I want to say, in 1919. So he would have been about 3, but he is one of those people who survived this, and he became one of the projects of this horrible event. So I'm going to start off with just a brief little introduction about why we're here today. In 1921, there was a thriving community in the Tulsa, basically, it's an African-American community which had been founded partially in conjunction with former slaves going into the free territories, as well as those who were brought across with the 5 nations of the 5 civilized nations of the Native American groups. That community thrived. It was one of the most prosperous communities within the United States up until there was an incident. An attempted lynching led to a confrontation between the citizens of Tulsa. The Black militia fought against and attempted to fight back against the mobs, which swelled into the hundreds and then eventually into the thousands, leading into one of the most devastating massacres of African-American communities. So Mr. Grayson here, who is an expert on the Tulsa incident, as well as the relationship between Native Americans and freedmen, is here to speak to us on that. He's also one of the leading advocates for the freedmen descendants of the 5 civilized tribes. So I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Grayson.
Hi. Hello, JSU fans. A little history. My father, who was from Beggs, Oklahoma, actually a Creek Indian, went to Jackson College in 1950. And that's where he met my mother. And I actually grew up on Jackson State campus as a kid. My dad is from Oklahoma. My mother is from Raymond, Mississippi, actually. But we grew up in Addition, which is right behind Jackson State. And as a kid, we used to play on that baseball field. I don't think it's there anymore. I haven't been there in a long time. But I grew up there, and my parents are, matter of fact, they got all their degrees from Jackson State University, and a couple of my sisters did as well. We are Creek. We're enrolled in the Muskogee Creek Nation here in Oklahoma. My ancestry are both Indian and African, and some white ancestry. But my African ancestry in the Creek Nation is very unique. I'm descended from Indians who were slavers and freedmen, Black people in the tribe who were actually enslaved by some of my own family members. So, but nonetheless, I'm in Road Creek. I live in Tulsa. I lived in California for 30 years before retiring back to the reservation here in the Muskogee Creek Nation. And one of the things that I've done for the last 25 years have fought for the rights of freedmen, former slave descendants of the Creek Nation, and their treaty rights that not only freed them in 1866, but granted them citizenship in the Creek Nation. And I want to make something clear. When Black people in America by the states were freed, known as Juneteenth, 1865 in Galveston, Texas, slavery went a whole nother year in Indian Territory. Black people, which is now Oklahoma, were not free from bondage or chattel slavery until the treaties of 1866. My own great-grandmother, Minerva Grayson, she was a slave of her actually father, was freed in she was 3 years old. She's my great-grandmother, my father's grandmother. And she was freed June 14th, 1866, a year after Black people in the States were lastly emancipated in Texas. So unfortunately, Indian Territory goes kind of unnoticed in American history because people don't believe that Indians enslaved Africans, and they actually did. And the 5 tribes, we call the 5 civilized tribes here, are the original 5 tribes of the Deep South. In Mississippi, where you are today, were the Choctaws, who were notorious slavers, and the Chickasaws, who were notorious slavers with their slave codes for African slavery, chattel slavery, before they were freed in 1866. I think the Choctaw and Chickasaw Treaty of 1866 was April 28, 1866. So it's a fascinating history. It's unknown to most people. I think, you know, growing up in Mississippi, I used to hear all the time neighbors saying that, oh yeah, we're a descendant of the Blackfoot tribe and all these names like that. And in our Creek history, what we've always been taught was the derogatory terms given by white plantation owners toward Black people who had been enslaved by tribal peoples, but sold during the Trail of Tears, and they didn't come out to Indian Territory. They remained in Mississippi under the new ownership of the new white plantations. And oftentimes those were called Blackfoot. It was unfortunate, but that's in our Creek history. So,
Mr. Grayson, and when did slavery between African Americans actually begin with the 5 tribes?
well, we don't say African American because at the time there were African people were not American, but I understand what you're saying. The first contact of African people in the Creek Nation was during the DeSoto period in 1541. And that's the first, and that brother was actually enslaved by DeSoto and escaped into the Cousas, who were part of the Confederacy of what we now say Creek people. We say Muskogee people. And you could follow him through the next 40 years of what happened to him. But the slavery itself as an institution pretty much started with the British colonies, you know, and the influence of the French, you know, and that was down in New Orleans area. But we have recorded Creek slave families, prominent families, as far back as the early 1800s. I mean, 18th century.
Thank you for that, sir. And so we're talking about this relationship. Can you tell us more about what happened amongst the freemen as well, amongst those who were enslaved on the Trail of Tears?
Well, you say again, freedmen, they were not free during that time.
I was trying to make sure I corrected myself on that one. Yes,
yeah,
sir.
They were enslaved African people. They were no different than the ox that were pulling the wagons. They were made to, particularly male enslaved Africans of the 5 tribes, were made to clean and clear fields and roads, and I mean fields, because there's no roads during that time, and create a path to the rivers that eventually led up into what we call Oklahoma today. We call it the Arkansas River. But the enslaved Africans were used as the machinery to cut the trees, to, you know, remove debris, whatever, for the wagons to come through. And they carried the weight of the Trail of Tears. We see images of the Trail of Tears, and we often see the images of poor Indians walking. And mind you, 90% of the tribal members, the Indian people, did not enslave African, but there was an elite group of Indian people who were enslaving people of African descent. But I believe if you look at Mississippi, for example, I believe I read somewhere that only 3% of white people enslaved all the Black people in the whole state. And yet 97% of the white people actually fought for the 3% right to enslave their Black people. Kind of like what we deal with today. Billionaires own everything, and we'll go to the war to protect their rights to do whatever they want to do around the world. Yet we have no dog in the fight other than we're going to fight for a billionaire's right to do what he wants to do. It's the same system back then, you know. So I know that was a little too much, but there you go.
Oh, it was a wonderful answer, sir. And can you describe how the Oklahoma communities form and how that relationship ends up developing what will be Tulsa and Middle Africa in Tulsa in particular?
Well, I know what you guys read and see, the propaganda, we say from the Creek Nation, a lot of propaganda and misinformation about Tulsa. But Tulsa itself was a area founded or established by what we call the Loja Boja people. Loja is the Muskogee word for turtle. And the Creek Nation, just to break down, on the Trail of Tears from Alabama, Georgia, and parts of Florida was 82 different tribes that made up the Creek Confederacy. One of those particular bands or tribes in the Confederacy was Loja Boja people settled, basically they were kicked off the boat just before, as far north as they can go into, well, I should have given you a better map. As far as they can go up into, before you went over into the Cherokee border. Tulsa itself, that's a great map right there. Tulsa itself sits on 3 tribes reservation. It's the Osages to the northwest, the Cherokee Nation to the east, and the Muskogee Creek Nation to the south. And when the Loja was brought out in the late 1830s, they basically got to the border of the Cherokee Nation and were dumped off. In that area that they were dumped off, we have a tree that's still in existence, hasn't been cut down. We call the council oak tree, is where they actually established their fires when they were kicked off the boat. That is the beginning of Tulsa. That's as far back as 1838 and 1839. And then you had the prominent family here, Indian family called the Perryman family. They're the ones that really set up the post office and all kind of things like that, that led to what we know as Tulsa today. Now, Tulsa itself, from the perspective of the Indian people here and the Freeman people, or tribal members, we think is an illegal city. We don't think it really has a right to exist. It's a violation of our 1866 treaty. It is a clear violation of our treaty. Yet, when oil and gas, well, oil was discovered in what became the Osage Reservation just north of Tulsa, the influx of squatters, white squatters and black squatters from the States came here and drove, and they outnumbered the small population of tribal members, Indians and freedmen that lived here. And then they were able to lobby Congress to allow them to build their houses, build their roads, put in schools. It's called the Town Site Act of 1901. It was a violation of our treaty. And so that's the beginning of it, but I'm the beginning of what we think of Tulsa today. But as far as its existence, it existed as an Indian town, some 6 decades before that even happened.
Okay, that's very insightful, sir. And so once we see this developing, this community start to develop, what are we starting to see? What kind of trends? Like, what do we see as far as the explosion of the population in Tulsa?
Well, there's a lot going on and during that time period. First of all, Oklahoma's, we have to go back to the allotment period and what was happening. You had, after the Civil War, and because the 5 tribes, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Muskogee Creeks, allied with the Confederate South to protect their right, their sovereign right, to enslave Black people, they lost the war. And as a condition of surrender, they lost 2/3 of their treaty lands from the 1830s treaty. And the Creek Nation lost a huge part of our lands. Oklahoma City all the way up to the Texas Panhandle was considered Muskogee Creek Nation area. They lost that land. That land to the west now of what's now Oklahoma was called Oklahoma Territory. And what was left of the 5 tribes became what was left of Indian Territory. That was in 1866. So, about the land runs and the whole thing with the Sooners in 1889 and, the various acts of Congress that led to the great squatting of that area from the various Indian tribes, and Black people settling there. All kinds of Black towns were established in Oklahoma Territory on what's called unassigned lands, lands that Indian tribes were not living on. Well, in the Indian Territory, with the push for statehood, the agreement was that the Indians of the 5 tribes, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Muskogee Creek, Seminoles, and Cherokees, were to be granted citizenship in the new state and American citizenship. This was called the 5 Civilized Tribes Citizenship Act of 1901. Oftentimes, you would read about Indian people across the United States being adopted as American citizens in the 1920s, and that is true, except for the 5 tribes, it was in 1901. And their condition for American nationality was statehood. They will allow the state to exist and replace their tribal governments. So to do this, they had to split the lands up individually to become individual land owners. Now, the custom in these tribes before statehood was that the tribal government owned every inch of land, every acre within their tribal reservation was not owned by an individual, but was owned by the tribal government itself. A tribal member had a right to use the land. They could petition the council, or what we call in the Creek Nation, the House of Kings and the House of Warriors, to say, hey, I'm getting married, I need 500 acres, I want it along this river. And the council will actually give them a 2-year lease to develop the land and do what they want to do with it. And every 2 years, that Indian or freedman person would have to go back to the council to actually renew the lease. If the leasee fell over dead, the land did not go to the kids or to the wife. They themselves would have to go back to the council to petition for another 2-year lease, because the land itself, every bit of it, was owned by the tribal government, not individuals. So for statehood to happen, the Congress actually passed the Dawes Act and later the Burke Act of April 26, 1906, to divide up the tribal lands to give it to individual tribal members. In the Muskogee Creek Nation, each tribal member, whether you were a freedman or a full-blood Indian, you received 160 acres. Now, in the Creek Nation, there was roughly about 8,000 freedmen. And let me back this up. The population of the Creek Nation at Oklahoma statehood in 1907 was roughly about 18,000 people. 8,000 was actually their former slaves, 8,000. And of the 10,000 that were actually Indian people, there's Pyro Bruner right there. I mean, yeah, that's, that's Hutton, Joe Hutton and his family. Among the 10,000 Indians, about 1/3 of them had some African ancestry. So you could see the overwhelming population of the Muskogee Creek Nation as statehood has some African ancestry. Back to the allotments, the 8,000 freedmen received each 160 acres if you were living between January 1st of 1898 and April 26, 1906. If you were just living one day in that time period, you received 160 acres. At the end of the allotments and before statehood, the Creek freedmen had received 1,092,240 acres of land. That was their combined total, 1,092,240 acres. That's just with 8,000 people. Now, if you do your homework and look at the US population census in Georgia in 1900, where you had hundreds of thousands of Black people, combinedly, they only owned about 1 million acres. In the Creek Nation, just within the jurisdiction of the Creek Nation, what became Oklahoma, 1,092,240 acres went to 8,000 Black people. That's not the Chickasaw Nation, Choctaw Nation, Cherokee Nation, and Seminole Nation, where you have the same amount of acreage given to their Freeman population. The interesting thing about Tulsa, being in the Creek Nation, most of the land around Tulsa was granted to freedmen. Most of the land, when you get outside of Tulsa, was actually Black owned. And today, Tulsa has absorbed a lot of that. There's a wealthy community, if you're ever in Oklahoma, called Jinx, which is South Tulsa. Wealthy. I mean, it's really a wealthy community. That used to be a Black town called Winty's Grove, a Black freedman town, established after the Civil War. Today, it's all pretty much all white and wealthy, you know, but there's a Black cemetery in the middle of all of it. You know, that's dated, the earliest grave, I think, is in the 1840s.
Can you explain for our students what the value is for land? Why are they receiving land as direct monetary funds?
Well, because the land had to be divided up, you know, and at that time they valued the Creek Nation, 160 acres was valued at $1,040, you know, and everybody got it. If you're a full-blood Indian, you got 160 acres. If you were a one-day-old freedman baby, you got 160 acres. If you were living between 1898 and 1906. And at the end of the allotments, statehood happened. Now, the ironic thing about statehood was that if you look at a map of Indian territory with the 5 tribes, you have over 3 million acres that Black people actually own. 3 million acres that Black people actually own in Indian territory. Now, there's a lot of women on this Zoom chat. I want to tell you this too. The allotments happen in Oklahoma territory as well, with the Cheyenne Arapaho and the Ponca and all these other tribes. They have the allotments too, as well as the 5 tribes. Women receive a share of that land as well. It was no discriminatory factor. You just had to be a tribal member. So at statehood, at Oklahoma statehood, this is a true fact, more than half the land was owned by minority women, whether they were Indian or freedmen. They were minorities. They owned half the land in the state and had no right to vote, had no right to represent themselves in the government whatsoever. So you could see the mess that happened after statehood with laws that was passed to dispossess them of their lands, not just Black people. So, in Oklahoma, in Indian territory, where of the 5 tribes, you had over 3 million acres that were given to the Black members of those tribes, they had no right to vote, none whatsoever in the new state. So all kind of laws was passed to dispossess them of their tribal lands, particularly because of this. If oil and gas was not found in Indian territory and in the Oklahoma territory, we wouldn't even be having this discussion. They would have just left these people alone because it would have been useless land. Oklahoma as statehood, just when a few years of statehood had become the Saudi Arabia of the world back in those days. And the Creek Nation was the center of it. I encourage all of you guys to read a book called Researching Sarah Rector, the richest Black girl in America. Researching Sarah Rector. She was a 2-year-old Black girl, freedman girl, who received 160 acres over in Drumright in the center of the Cushing oil field. She was instantly a millionaire, but she's running around with no shoes on. And the people that had taken her lease was building mansions, and she's running around with no shoes on. The NAACP had to come get her in 1914 when she was a young girl and take her to Kansas just to save her life. And how they actually saved her life was actually creating a false birth certificate and putting her race as white instead of Black or Negro during that time. And that's how she was able to collect her oil and gas royalties back in the day. And yet she was actually a freedman girl who luckily received 160 acres in an area that became the richest oil reserve in America's history. Researcher, Her name
It
is,
should also be noted that in 1907, at the statehood of Oklahoma, the value of $1,040 as equated today is roughly around $37,000.
yeah, and brother, it also depends on where it's at. You had allotments that, you know, remember I told you about the Town Site Act in 1901 that established the 654 acres that established Tulsa illegally. Also was established was Bristow, Muskogee, Coweta, Okmulgee, I mean, all around you had these areas, including the all black towns that Oklahoma is notoriously noted for are named in that act of Congress. And if you were able to secure an allotment around those urban areas, your allotment, though on paper, when the Dawes Commission gave it out, was only worth $1,040, was actually worth much more than an allotment way out in the middle of, you know, Post Oak and Blackjacks that you can't get to. And so you had a whole lot of scamming and crap going on. Greenwood itself, you know, I often hear people that misinformation about O.W. Gurley buying 40 acres and all, which would have been totally illegal. You know, it was a violation of Indian law. You had to be a tribal member to have land back in those days. You couldn't be a state person or any of that. You had to be a tribal member. And O.W. Gurley, though he lived in Oklahoma Territory, initially ended up coming to Indian Territory before statehood, and when Tulsa was really taken off, and was a real estate agent. The woman who actually owned the land where Greenwood is, where the majority of Greenwood is today, was a woman named Mary Turley, who was a Cherokee Indian citizen. And often Turley is actually confused with Gurley on a map. And it was actually Mary Turley. Her husband actually developed on her brother's allotment, was called Turley, Oklahoma. And if you're from Tulsa, you know Turley as being one of the communities just north of Tulsa, you know. And I want to say this while you guys are doing your research, particularly in Mississippi where you're at, and you're researching Civil War battles, you also research the Civil War battles that took place in Indian Territory. One of which was just right north of Greenwood, where over 700 Black people were slaughtered by the Cherokee Nation. Did you hear me? 700 in 2 war battles. And these Black people were following a chief of the Creeks named Obethely Yahola, who was actually a slaver himself, to Kansas to avoid the war. And as they were running north on that trail we call Fire and Ice up to Kansas, the Cherokee Nation just murdered men, women, and babies who were defenseless, Black people who were enslaved, you know, and they were captured, the Indians, because they saw some value in their lives. But for the African slave, they would just kill them on the spot, you know, and yet it's not talked about in history studies around the country. And it's a shame. You can read about it on the internet, it's there. It's just not one of those things that's actually promoted, and certainly not promoted in this state of Oklahoma. So hardly any Indian teachings are promoted in Oklahoma too. But anyway, so the beginning of Tulsa was an illegal act called the Town Site Act. 654 acres were taken from the Creek Nation to establish it. They hired 2 brothers named Gus and Dave Patton from Greenwood, Arkansas, which is what the Greenwood district is named for, to plat the area out. And then, according to that act of Congress, the little plats and lots that they were creating were to be sold to the, you know, the first sale of it. The money was supposed to be reimbursed back to the Creek Nation. And the scam of the day was that a lot that at that time would have had a value of $5,000 were being sold for $5. And that's the money went to the Creek Nation. And then whoever got it would flip it and sell it at market value. There was a lot of con crap going on that the US government actually orchestrated along with the new state officials of Oklahoma. So But around the area, if you look at a map of Greenwood, if you ever come here, the area called Archer and Greenwood, which is the last remaining part that wasn't destroyed in 1978 by the city, is still there. That part is in the Creek Nation. When you go north under the bridge, if you ever get to make a trip here, as soon as you cross under that bridge, there's a church to the right called Mount, oh, good Lord, Jordan. Oh my God, he's going to kill me for remember that. There's a church to the right. That's in the Cherokee Nation. It's the last church actually surviving the race massacre. And then the Greenwood Cultural Center to the left, you're in the Cherokee Nation. But if you go south under the highway, you're in the Muskogee Creek Nation. And that's the boundaries that the community of Greenwood actually sits on. It sits on the Creek Reservation, and it also sits in the Cherokee Nation Reservation. So, but people often concentrate on the Greenwood Boulevard as being the money source for the community, and it wasn't. It was the 3 million acres that was in eastern Oklahoma that was actually making people wealthy. And if you talk about Boley, for example, and you only talk about Boley Main Street and Boley's Bank as the all black town, but you don't talk about the 100,000 acres that black freedmen own around Boley, you're missing the point. And during those days, what was the king of the economy here was agriculture, particularly since you had World War I going on in Europe and they couldn't grow anything because they were killing and burning each other's crops down. And so the Americans actually took advantage of that system and was shipping everything, agriculture, to Europe. And so
one of our fine scholars wanted me to let you know it's they believe it's Mount Vernon that you're talking about.
Mount Vernon, yes, thank you. Yeah, let me have a cup of coffee. It's been a long.
Oh, I know the feeling.
So,
I definitely know the feeling.
So you had agriculture being king, and if you own land like the freedmen did, you did very well. The only thing in the new state of Oklahoma, black people can only spend money in places. That was the Jim Crow system. And so their all black communities kind of thrived off the black dollars because it kept circulating within the black communities. But the money was not created on Main Street. It was created in the rural area where the freedmen actually owned over 3 million acres of land. Then to top that off, you had the discovery of oil, which is what the boom was about, and why Tulsa itself went from a population of 1,500 in 1900 to 78,000 in 1920, just before the massacre. And it was mainly people coming here looking for their black gold, so to speak. I mean, I think I'm looking at a lot of faces that should remember the Beverly Hillbillies and that old song about black gold. That's what this area was about. And people were coming here, immigrating here, black and white. And I need to say this too, because the freedmen people have a different status as black people in the state of Oklahoma. And if you read anything about it, there was a term back in the day used as the native blacks. They were called the freedmen and black Indians. And then there was a term used called state Negroes, who were the black people from immigrating from the states, from Mississippi, from Chicago, from New York, all over the places, coming here looking for work. Now the freedmen themselves, as far as living in Greenwood, that wasn't their community. These were the freedmen people, or the black Indians of Indian Territory. They were landowners. They didn't need to live in a small apartment or a little house on a block when they owned 160 acres apiece. They lived out in the country, and that's where the money was actually being made and brought to town to spend. And that's where their money actually created Greenwood and other places. And the people that were actually living in Greenwood, if you look at the 1920 US population census, which is the last census taken before the 21 race massacre, you can actually see what people actually, where they were from, what they were doing, what kind of work they were doing, all kind of stuff. And even if they served in World War I, it was listed there. So, and most of those people were actually from the States. And the area of Greenwood was very undeveloped at that time, not like the wealthy part of the white part of Tulsa. You had an influx of African Americans coming here with no place to stay. There was no housing. It was so undeveloped. So on the US population census in 1920, you'll find a mom and dad and a couple of kids and about 10 boarders in their homes. And these people have come here from New York and Chicago, Philadelphia, all over the place, looking to work in the oil and gas industry that was taken off. So anyway, I just wanted to get that out there because that's often missing in the story of Greenwood when you're talking about the massacre. But you cannot talk about the wealth of Greenwood and blame the wealth on a barbershop and a hotel. That wasn't created wealth. That's where people were spending their dollars. The wealth was created on 3 million acres in eastern Oklahoma in the new state that was owned by Black people who happen to be former enslaved Africans of the 5 tribes.
All right. We're running a bit short on time. Can we move to the actual events of the 1921 massacre?
Okay.
Well, make sure we still have time for questions afterwards. So.
All right. There's a lot of documentaries and stuff about that. About Roland and the elevator and I can go through that, but that's just written history and it did happen. It was a tragedy that it happened, but a lot of the jealousy, I think, is mistaken. They often say that the white community was jealous of the Black community being so successful. No, they were jealous of the 3 million acres that Black people actually own. And you can imagine this, being from your state. If you were a white person that left Mississippi to come here to the new state of Oklahoma, looking for your Black gold, and you're finding that every other acre is actually owned by a Black person who happened to just get their US citizenship in 1901. The jealousy was real. The insanity of how can we steal their lands were so great, and particularly since you can come from Mississippi after 1907 and be here one day if you're a white male and register to vote. You could be a Black person in the Creek Nation and been here since the 1820s and cannot vote and own the land and had no representation in the state capitol at all. And so these new laws that were created to dispossess them of their lands were intense, from the taxes that were outrageous, and the scams that went on, even with Black funeral homes, scamming freedmen people out of their lands was incredible during that time. So I encourage any of you guys, there's one video that's on HBO right now, HBO Max, that James LeBron's did, called Dreamland. It's one of the best ones that are out there. Oprah was here and did some, PBS did some, on and on. But James LeBron goes into a little of the pre-statehood history of why Tulsa actually existed and who the people were. Yeah, LeBron James. Yes.
Yes, sir. And you've actually been in 2 of those documentaries, am I correct?
I've been in 7.
7? Okay, I'll pull up your IMDb and pull up 2. But yes, I know you've been in several of them.
Yeah. So, but, the point that the tribe tries to make is that Greenwood did not show up in 1905. All of that to us is nonsense. The area was actually called a Black community called Hodges Bends. That's where the initial Black community started. That's now Greenwood. It started right after the Civil War when the railroad tracks came through. And the Creek Freedmen, who were hired to build the railroad coming through the Creek Nation, didn't want to go into the Cherokee Nation where the bend of the railroad actually went north. They didn't want to go because it was just a few years earlier that the Cherokees had slaughtered their relatives. So that settlement that were created on the Creek Nation side, they called it Hodges Bend. That was the Black area of Creek Freedmen actually establishing the area. And then just south of there was Renty's Grove. And then you had the whole bunch of allotment lands. I don't know if you ever look at a map of Tulsa, you look at Tulsa University, which is just east of downtown. Those are Freeman allotments. You look at Oral Roberts University, it's sitting on Leggett Perryman's allotment, who's a Black Indian chief, and the Creek Freeman woman next to his allotment, that makes up Oral Roberts allotment. If you've seen anything about the race massacre and the uncovering of the mass graves that they found in the Oaklawn Cemetery, that was a Freeman allotment named Centennial Manuel, who's a 17-year-old girl who received 160 acres. And ironically, one of the wealthiest communities in Tulsa sits on her property. She never got the benefit from it, never. It was taken from her by the time she was 18 years old.
So
yes.
I don't know if I missed it. If I did, I apologize. But did you share with us how much land the Freemans have today? And secondly,
hardly any, zero, just about nothing. There are occasional.
So what were the laws that they used? Because we were led to believe that Indian land was somehow exempt from government. That's our history. We know it's wrong, but we were led to.
It's actually a myth that's out there. Congress passed various acts that affected people in categories. The Creek Freemen, for example, land became our homestead. You got to think, 160 acres. And give me 1 second. I need to plug my computer in. My battery is getting low. Hold on 1 second. Sorry about that. You have each tribal member in the Creek Nation receiving 160 acres. 120 was considered surplus and 40 was considered homestead. And what the federal government did for the freedmen up until I think 1922 or something, the allotment, as long as it was owned by the freedman allottee, was tax exempt, the homestead, but not the surplus. In the Cherokee Nation, the entire 160 acres was exempt as long as the allottee was actually living. In the Choctaw Chickasaw Nation, and the dirty thing about the Choctaws and Chickasaws was that the Indians and their intermarried white husbands, I want you to hear this, their intermarried white husband received 320 acres. If you had one drop of black blood, one drop of black blood in Chickasaw Choctaw Nation, you only got 40 acres. So that's some of the racism that was going on during that time. But immediately the Congress started passing in categories how to dispossess the freedmen from their lands. And it was usually through taxes. And they allowed the counties and the towns and all of this to develop taxes against them. And you got to remember, these are people who have been with the Indians for centuries. And the Indians didn't own land. The tribal government owned the land, but not individual Indians. So they were not familiar with the American system of owning land and have to pay taxes. All of a sudden, 160 acres were popped on them, and then the new counties sent them out tax bills. And the way the system was around the Creek Nation, for example, you have mom and dad who got 160 acres, and they have 5 kids who got 160 acres apiece. Do you think they put all of those allotments together? No. They put one 100 miles away, the other one 100 miles from that one, the last kid 150 miles south of that. Nobody's allotments ended up being together. So you have parents who are struggling to pay the property taxes on their allotments themselves and feed their kids. And they're thinking about, well, what are we going to do with baby Johnny, who's 2 years old, and his allotment is way down in Hughes County that we've never seen. We just have the paperwork for it. And all of a sudden the taxes are due and they don't have money for it. And then the county comes in and confiscates the property. It was the biggest scam that the federal government ever committed. And nobody does anything about it. The tribes who know about it don't do anything about it because they're busy kicking out the Black people today. So they don't want to help. You know, even though it is a classic class action lawsuit that should be brought against the state of Oklahoma. And yet, because the tribes today have been busy kicking out their Black citizens in violation of their treaty rights, have ignored all of these things that should be taken care of. She asked how much of that Freeman allotment exists today. Probably less than 2% of the 3 million acres exists today. Yeah. And if you want to talk about the disappearance of Greenwood, after it was burned down in 1921, by 1923, it was not only built back, it was built bigger and back and better. But through the years, as the Freedmen allotments disappeared into the hands of white people, these Black towns disappeared too, because there was no monies being generated from their allotments, from the rural areas through agriculture and oil and gas to bring to those Black dollars to those Black communities. The land just disappeared. So did the Black towns.
So the reason that nothing is being done even today is because of what?
Because the racism is 1905 in Oklahoma. That's why. I'm just going to be honest. There's a concerted effort to wash the Freedmen out of our history. Matter of fact, if you go to the Muskogee Creek Nation website and read about the history of our tribe, they talk about all that stuff in the Shakota Mounds and all that stuff 1,500 years ago. And then they skip to 1970. They don't talk about any of their history in enslaving Black people. None, zero. You got to figure it out. And that's with all 5 of them. And recently, the Cherokee Nation and the Seminole Nation has started including, particularly since it's Black History Month here in Tulsa, here in Oklahoma, some Freedmen history, but it's a joke. It's actually really weak. But you know, they redwashed this history. You know, and the reality is, this is the truth about the 5 tribes in Oklahoma. They're mainly white people. If you know anything about Congressman Markwayne Mullin, the governor of Oklahoma named Stitt, these are tribal members. Governor Stitt, who looks like Fred Flintstone, is a member of the Cherokee Nation. Markwayne Mullin is a member of the Cherokee Nation. Tom Cole, Congressman Tom Cole from Oklahoma, is a member of the Chickasaw Nation. And they are white people. So figure it out. You know what's going on. And though these tribes have Indian members, there are very few of them. We have very few full-bloods in these tribes. The majority of the tribal members of the 5 civilized tribes are less than a quarter blood. And most of them are less than 1/8. So, and then all of this is about economics. Who gets to control those federal dollars that come to Oklahoma? And these tribes, through the federal government, bring billions of dollars in monies to the state of Oklahoma. And the tribes get to control them, but who gets to control the tribes? So guess who gets cut out of the pie?
So the Freeman membership is really low now today?
Intentionally. In the 2 tribes that we fought legally through the courts to fight for their treaty rights, which was Seminole Nation back in 1998 when Bill Clinton was president. He shut down the Seminole Nation when they kicked out the Black people. He just locked the doors and made them go to court. They lost him. The Seminole Nation lost in court. And the Freeman Treaty, the Seminole Treaty of May 21st, 1866, was confirmed by the courts that the Seminoles Freedmen were indeed legal tribal members of the Seminole Nation. Now, then, you know, the Creek Nation kicked its Black people out in 1978. The Choctaw Nation, and not to confuse that with the Mississippi Choctaws, by the way, the Choctaw Nation in Oklahoma kicked its Blacks out in 1982. The Cherokee Nation, about 20 years ago, kicked its Black people out with a vote, just voted them out of the tribe. And so all of these have led to legal lawsuits in the federal courts. And ironically, the tribes have learned through how not to lose these cases. And the process of the legal cases in Indian Territory, by law, you have to go through tribal courts. And so in 20 years ago, the Cherokee Nation would allow these to go through. And of course, their judges and stuff would say, oh, the freedmen have no rights, all this stuff, and the freedmen would lose. But then you can appeal to the federal courts, and that's where the freedmen would actually win. So today, the scheme of what the tribes are doing, the Creek Nation in particular, is to get these cases in tribal court, and then they'll put a judge on the case. And so they just linger in the books and don't go to federal courts. And so we're now having to go to Congress to say, hey, these, kangaroo courts are back at it again, and they're, putting their feet on the necks of their Black people. It's the same thing that was happening in Mississippi. These tribes are actually doing that stuff. And so, and I want you not to think these are some full-bloods that are doing, no, that's not what these tribes look like. And the goal of the whole thing is to control the billions of dollars, not just in casino revenue. Matter of fact, the Creek Nation largest casino is just right down the street from me. It's called River Spirit. It sits on a freedman allotment named Louisa Mackey, and none of her kids, none of her freedman descendant kids can enroll in the tribe to benefit from it, yet the casino is sitting on her property. And then you got the billions that come in through federal contracts and on and on and on. And they usually matriculate through the system, through the Indian systems, through the hands of their white members. And the Black folks are left out.
And just to add on what Mr. Grayson said, the Mississippi bands actually have a different relationship with their Black members. They actually, many of them, the actual band of Choctaw actually, the Choctaw band out in Philadelphia actually comes to Jackson State. They have a big contingent and we go out there. So it's been a strong relationship between us and the Mississippi bands of these other groups.
Yeah, but I'm going to say this, brother. The Mississippi Band of Choctaws also have a one-half blood quantum system. So any of their people who are less than one half, any of their tribal members who are one half, and they go out and they marry someone Black and their kids become 1/4 or whatever, they're not allowed to enroll in the tribe. That needs to be clear. I'm listening. I'm just going to plug this in. Hold on one second. But go ahead.
Have we got any other questions from the audience?
I'm listening. Replug my computer.
I was going to ask what role did the census have in terms of documenting some of that? I'm born in that area. And when you look at some of the documents that document freedmen, it seems like there's a gap. So you'll see a household that has freedmen and then they may not show back up, or you may not be able to find them again, even though they really never left the area.
I'm glad you asked that because this is fascinating. The US population census acted accordingly to Oklahoma state law. And the first law is on the book, the one drop blood, you became Black. Well, you'll see on the 1900 population census of Indian territories, these families listed in the Creek Nation as Indian, IN all the way down. Mm-hmm. And yet, on the 1920 population census, after stuff got established, because of the one drop rule, they're listed as NEG, all the way down. And these people on the Dawes Road could be listed as 3/4 Indian, 15 Indian, all of that. And if you were a full blood married to someone with a drop of African blood, you went down as Black too.
Yeah, okay.
On the 1920 population census. But I will say the tribes do not use the US population census for anything.
Yeah.
Not at all. We don't even recognize it for anything other than, if you want to do research of where your folks were from, that's fine. But we don't use it as a legal document for anything. And
we have a comment from a Mr. Nicholas Organ. Mr. Organ wrote, I also read that after Greenwood was rebuilt, it was destroyed again in order to build a highway.
Well, it was, the highway is a big deal here. Greenwood, like I said, by 1923 was actually built back better because the oil and gas industry was, you know, at the height of its day back in those days. So, and then the Freedmen still owned a huge chunk of land in eastern Oklahoma. So the monies were still there and the money still need to be spent somewhere. So the town, the community, the neighborhood was actually built. I will say this too, that's often overlooked. Muskogee, Oklahoma had 2 Black communities with actually banks. They were way more wealthier than Greenwood, and they're often overlooked because there was no dramatic drama that happened in that town, you know, but as the Freedmen lost their land, so did the Black communities disappear in Muskogee. But and so anyway, by 1978, the city had eminent domain, the majority of Greenwood, because it was right on the border of downtown. And they wanted it for, you know, development and on and on and on. So they came in, instead of burning it down, they used bulldozers. And they bulldozed the entire community. They left a corner section there called Greenwood and Archer to remind you of what used to be there. But that's it. Everything else has become Oklahoma State University. There's a building there for Langston. There's a PBS station. There's some stuff that you can recognize, but it's not there anymore. And folks come here and they look and they go, oh, wow. You mean this whole vacant area, all these 40 acres, 50 acres that are just nothing there? That's where the town was burned down? No, the town was built back and better. The city bulldozed that in 1978.
Okay, well, we're down to about 5 minutes. I'd like to invite Dr. Azevedo or Dr. KB Turner or Dr. Mosley to speak with us a little bit.
Dr. The Provost, go ahead.
I don't have much to say. I'm thrilled that we are talking about some of these issues. Like I said, I'm born in Muskogee, got land in Reynoldsville and Oklahoma, so very interested in this work and so glad that it's being lifted up. So thank you for coming to this virtual space, and I hope we have an opportunity to do something like this again. This has been great.
I'm glad you mentioned Oklahoma. That's where some of my folks are from.
Dr. Turner or Dr. Azevedo?
Connect with you, we probably can.
I truly enjoyed this this lecture because not much we know about Indians, how they treated their own people and others. My question, my comment was based on the concept of slavery, indentured servitude, and then servitude in Africa. And then the speaker just mentioned that the Romans and the Greeks, I think, have that. A lot of historians who tend to favor slavery, they say that the Africans had slavery even before the white people came to capture some. I'm just wondering how the speaker defines what was going on in Africa, particularly before the invasion of the Arabs during the 19th century, and what was going in Rome and Athens, where you had a policy of assimilating the peoples that had conquered. And then I also can note that a few years ago, some African-American historians have disputed the date of 1619 as the beginning of slavery in the US, with the landing of the slaves, quote unquote slaves, in Jamestown. Can you make any comment on just in 3 minutes, because I don't want to take Dr. Mosley's still.
Slavery was not, slavery in Indian country did not start with Black folk. Tribes would enslave each other. That's just a human condition. You find it around the world. You know, so the Black people from Africa happen to be just a different product of the day. But the Creeks, the various Creeks will war against each other, the tribes, and the loser would actually be slaves of the winners. That was just a system that was, you know, here before the chattel slavery started within the 5 tribes. And I want to say something about chattel slavery, what it meant. You had a lot of Black people who could be considered Black today, but were tribal members in the Creek Nation actually enslaving Black people. And here's how the system worked. If your mother had a clan and was a citizen of the tribe, then the child was.
Yeah.
If the mother was an enslaved person and the father was the chief of the tribe, a full-blood Indian.
That's right. That's right.
The child followed the mother's status and was a slave. That's chattel slavery. And so you had many instances where African men would have kids with Indian women who had a clan status in the Creek and Seminole Nation, and their children were considered free. But you had just as many cases of an Indian man raping an African woman and producing more product for his family to enslave. They would have no rights whatsoever but to be enslaved in the tribe.
Thank you.
And we're running out of time, so let's go ahead and get Dr. Turner on real quick.
Yes, I would echo the remarks of the provost and also Dr. Osvaldo. For years, I've taught a course in criminal justice called Race, Ethnicity, and Criminal Justice, again, for many, many years, and I always started with American Indians in criminal justice, but I've never really covered this aspect of history. So when I teach that course again, I would be sure to include this part of history because so many people aren't aware of this history. But your lecture also reminds me of the importance that we at HBCUs in particular, and I've made this comment in other forums, we must teach CRT. We must teach our history. We must pass it on to those behind us. So thanks so very much for your presentation. It was most informative.
And thank you, Josh. And thank you, Josh, for organizing this with collaboration with the Department of History. And thank you, Mr. Grayson. Very educational, very informative.
Can I give you 2 books to read that are really good?
Please do.
I want to read about pre-Civil War history dealing with African people in the Creek Nation or Cherokee Nation, whatever. Creeks and African and Creeks by Dr. Daniel Littlefield from the University of Arkansas in Little Rock. He's written Cherokees, Africans and Cherokees, Chickasaws and Africans and Chickasaws, all these various books on pre-Civil War history of slavery within these 5 tribes. Also in the Creek Nation, there's a terrific book by Gary Zeller called African Creeks, which deal with post-Civil War era, before statehood and after the Civil War. You ended up with a person named Jesse Franklin. I bet you've never heard of him. He was actually the first Black person to serve on a Supreme Court in the United States. It just happened to be the Muskogee Creek Nation Supreme Court. He was a former slave of my 5th grade grandmother. And in 1878, the Creek Council and the House of Kings appointed him to be one of the chief justices of our Supreme Court. This brother had a right to put you to death if you committed murder. He was on that court until he died in 1883. His name is Jesse Franklin. He's not mentioned in history anywhere, you know? So, but there's African Creeks by Gary Zeller. There's a terrific book. Researching Sarah Rector is another terrific book. But there are a lot of books out there, particularly today that's coming out, written on this subject. And I hope it get included into you guys' curriculum.
Thank you. Again, thank you. Thank everyone for attending. Thank you so much.